Hello. Not sure if... Oh, great. Awesome. Hello. I'm Laura Glazer, the host of Book Looking. And Book Looking is a project I'm undertaking to increase my understanding of artist books, publishing as an artistic practice, and looking at books with other people. This is the second episode, and the first one was about 2 weeks ago. And I would definitely say I've learned quite a bit, even in those past 2 weeks, including a little bit about how to write about artist books through the Book Looking newsletter. And if you're interested in reading that, the link to it is in the Instagram post on this account. And I'll also share it later. But for now, I want to let you know that today I'll be discussing a seminal photo book called The Pond by photographer John Gossage. It was first published in 1985 and it was republished in 2010, both times by Aperture. Unfortunately, all the copies are very expensive and hard to come by. I was lucky enough to get one through interlibrary loan from the Portland State University Library. There are 108 pages with 52 black and white photographs. It originally cost $65 in 2010. I don't know the original price in 1985. Today's special guest is an artist and the founder and co-director of the Art and Social Practice MFA program, of which I am a second-year student. He's been making visual art and socially engaged art since the 90s, and I'm really excited to welcome Harrell Fletcher to Book Looking. And it'll just take one moment while I welcome him into this room. I think it worked. Oh, hey.
Hey,
Welcome.
thank you.
Great. Well, I just gave a really short description of The Pond, but I'd love to hear how you describe this book to a friend.
Okay. Well, so I have my copy here, which has the dust jacket that Laura's copy doesn't have. Yeah, so I've got a version of that on the inside here. But one of the things actually about it, I think, that's sort of interesting is that the photo on the actual cover, there were a few different ones, and so this is the one that I've got, which is that's different than the one you've got on your copy, right? Oh no, it is the
No.
same. No, it is the same. Okay, I think we wound up with the same one, but I think there were at least 3 or 5 different ones or something like that. Yeah, so in some ways, I guess it's a fairly traditional photography book, which is, I guess, at this point, a sort of genre of art book, type of art book. And there are certain publishers associated with those kinds of books, and Aperture is probably the primary one that that we might have thought about operating over the last, I don't know, 40 years or something like that. I'm not quite sure how long they've been around. They also have a journal and other activities that they do. It's a foundation too. And so they published and have published lots and lots of photography books over the decades by, lots of photographers that people would know of. Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, all of those types, and then contemporary ones too. Wendy Red Star's got one coming out in the very near future through Aperture also. Yeah. So, so anyway, so they're kind of this classic photography and sort of bridging photography and like and art. This gets a little historical. Maybe it's not that interesting, but there was a point. There was a time when photography really wasn't considered art, in
Right.
a museum, high art way. And as a result of that, there were various organizations, publishers, galleries, societies that were attempting to, in some ways, uh, sort of become an extra resource to photography because it felt like it was being left out of the art world, I guess. At some
Yeah.
point, that stopped really being the case, and photography became almost dominant in the art world. And so you'd go into a contemporary art museum, or galleries, and it was quite likely that what you might be seeing there would be photographs. Some of these people who were using photographs, like the Jeff Wall era or something, um, were of a different sort than this previous John Gossage set of folks. Um, and and Gossage, actually, one of Gossage's contemporaries, both Gossage and this person are still alive, still making photographs, but is Robert Adams, who actually lives here in Astoria, and also really sort of made this crossover. It's interesting. He shows at I can't remember which one, but like a huge Chelsea gallery that the people that would normally not be like photographers who made small black and white prints. That era did a lot of those people didn't transfer over into the art world when it became big and
Oh,
in this other way, and Jeff Wall style huge photographs, and in his case light boxes. Cindy Sherman, different category of people
yeah.
of using photography. Anyway, so John Gossage is sort of from this other period where there was still, I think, remnants of a sense that photography was being treated as a second class medium,
Oh,
and that photographers weren't. And so there were these attempts to like give special extra stuff. And I think Blue Sky Gallery, which is here in Portland, is an example of that. Like
wow.
an
Yeah.
attempt to sort of fill in um, maybe what seemed like a neglected thing, that there wouldn't necessarily have been photography. Even like photography departments in museums are relatively new, in the scheme of things. Painting departments,
Oh,
sculpture departments, much older. That was what museums were sort of built off of, and then photography was sort of this new thing. Since then, we've seen lots of other things: video, performance, web-based things, even social practice kinds of stuff entering museum and gallery spaces. But oftentimes, in a similar sort of way, there's initially a resistance, and so
mm.
it's not treated in the same way. Anyway, this is some background stuff. The
Yeah.
pond, the pond itself is, yeah, it's a book, like I said, like published by Aperture, um, looking pretty similar to normal photo book, although it's probably would have been pretty typical for a photo book to have a photo on the front cover. And even though there is one underneath the dust jacket, like this is what you would normally see, this very bold text-based um, uh, design on the front cover with also these sort of unusual colors and everything. And then it just says a book of 49 photographs by John Gossage um, there. And so then, and it's not, you're asking, it's got the price tag. It was $40 new original. And it also, this is just my own, like, I'm already getting into my personal take on this, but I don't know if you can see this or not, but I paid, what does that say?
I can't read it.
It's at $24. I paid
What?
$24. It's written in pencil there. I don't know if it's visible. Um, and I bought it at Moe's bookstore in Berkeley in probably around 1990. And they had a kind of rare books section that wasn't part of the normal stacks. You had to go up the stairway, and it was like in a different room. Powell's kind of has a rare book thing too. This one was a little bit less like antiquity style books and more just sort of like unusual art books and things like that. And so I would go there all the time when I lived in the Bay Area and just sort of look through the books they had. And what I was mostly hunting for were books that I'd already developed a relationship through borrowing them from libraries. So I found them in libraries, and then I was trying to get my own copies eventually, and that's how I wound up with this copy of The Pond. Anyway, so then it's like, as it says, it's got 49 photographs. They're black and white photographs, and they look kind of like classic, at first glance, sort of like classic black and white, nicely printed landscape photographs. But, and this is sort of part of a broader movement that Robert Adams was a part of also, is that both of those photographers were the category they were sort of put into was called New Topographics. And the New Topographics photographers, which also included like Louis Baltz and Joe Deal and a few other folks, they were taking what kind of looked like a almost at first glance normal photograph, like normal landscape photographs, but they weren't, instead of photographing, let's say, the classic like Ansel Adams beautiful photograph in Yosemite or something like that, in which there's no hint of human activity. That's like part of the thing, is to like that would ruin it. We just want the nature part, And so that was how the Ansel Adams time period was in some ways defined, was like, and to some degree Edward Weston and other folks like that, where there was a focus on nature, and the human part of nature was left out. In the case of the New Topographic folks, they threw that off by taking, again, like these sort of like technically nicely made black and white photographs, sometimes color eventually, but they were including all of these little bits and pieces of human interaction with nature. And so like the photo you just showed, it's like there's some nature there, but there's also some like infrastructure stuff. And in classic like Robert Adams things, there might be like what seems like a pretty beautiful landscape with like a plane flying through it, or a freeway in the background, or just like somebody's garbage lying on the ground. And instead of like picking it up and moving it out of the picture, his decision is, this is actually interesting that we're having this interplay between idealized concepts of nature that were dominant in the sort of the Ansel Adams era, and then are being shown, instead of hiding those aspects, it's being featured, and in this kind of funny way where at first glance it seems like it could be one of those photos, and then you look a little deeper and you see this other stuff. So in the case of this particular book, John Gossage's, he I guess my understanding of it is that he would just go for walks around his neighborhood, and I think, I should have looked this up a little bit more, but I think that these were taken near Washington, D.C.
Yeah, he was going to school at a school called Walden School. So that crossover between Walden Pond and going to Walden School, I'm sure there's a story connecting all of that.
Yeah. So he would just go for these walks to this little pond that was near his house, and so then he started photographing, and so it's sort of like it's just documenting a walk. At least that's the impression I get. They were probably taken over a period of time, and it wasn't just a single walk. It's not set up like that conceptually or anything. But and it ends. The last photograph, I'm pretty sure, is a photograph of his front door. So it doesn't fit with the nature landscape ones. It's just this strange kind of formal kind of abstraction of like re-entering the house. So I got, anyway, so that's what it was. He's got this other little element that's in there too. This is like one of the only other elements. There's a really nice, I don't know whether to call it an essay or just a story by this writer, Denise Sines, in the beginning, which wasn't included in the reprint. The second edition didn't have that. It had a different text. And this one, this is just, interesting, where he marked out everything except for the pond. And that, I guess, is sort of the inspiration for the title. But it's also literally what he was photographing was just a pond that was near his house. And kind of the interstitial stuff in between his house and the pond, and this little like nature spot, which probably is kind of like, if people are in Portland, maybe sort of a little bit like Whitaker Pond, like this funny little pond that's surrounded by not nature, like by urban randomness, streets and utilities and businesses and things like that. And then suddenly there's this like little bit of nature in there.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's what the photographs, the photographs are like, and that's what the book is. And it's a chunky, heavy, very nicely produced, high quality style photographic book. But
Totally.
but then yeah, there's some things that are different about it also.
So what year did this book come into your life? Not when you owned it, but when did you see it?
So I first encountered it at the Humboldt State University Library, probably around 1987, something like that. When I was an undergraduate student there.
And did you get it? Like what was your first reaction? Because this isn't like many of the photo books beforehand. It's like there's pre-pond and post-pond. How did you respond to it?
So my process was, back then, so I was a student at Humboldt State, and mostly taking art classes, before I ended up transferring and getting my undergraduate degree from the San Francisco Art Institute. So I went to Humboldt State for 3 years. And while I was there, I just in general liked books. I'd already been looking a lot at art books of various kinds and photography books when I was younger. And so I found the photography section. I'm pretty sure it's TR. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah,
In the
TR.
library? Yeah, okay. So I'd head over to the TR section, pretty much every day. It just was like part of my daily routine. This is a very tiny town, Arcata, with the population at that time was, maybe like 12,000 people, something like that, with half of them being students, people at the university. Not a whole lot to do. Beautiful redwood forest, beautiful coast, farmlands. So I would go for walks and hikes and do that kind of stuff, but there wasn't a lot of like cultural things going on. There were 2 movie theaters in town. There was, lectures that would happen at the university, things like that. And I would do all of those things, but I had time on my hands. And so part of my daily routine was just to go to this library. And again, and something too, to just point out, it's obvious, in 1980s, there was no internet. There was no cell phone or anything like this. And so I couldn't access interesting art or books, anything, just on the internet, or look up artists or something like that. So the main way to do that, especially in a small town that didn't have a museum or anything like that, was through the library. And so I had developed, even when I was younger, in my own hometown, which also didn't have a museum or anything like that, Santa Maria, California, a small agricultural town in California, I went and spent a lot of time at the library there. And so then I just transitioned it. And I think I'm one of these people, there are many out there who just feel at home in a library. So even when I've like traveled to foreign countries, I'll gravitate to a library and find it relaxing and just go in, even if I can't read the books because it's in a foreign language or something like that. Yeah, and definitely if it's in a place where I can read the books, then I'll head on over. Almost any town that was in a way like part of my research process was I'd sort of look for where the library was, any kind of library, and head on in and sort of dig around. But it was also just like a very comfortable, relaxing space for me. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw it as part of my education, but I wasn't going to the library to do homework or to do some kind of research for school projects. It was part of what I was taking photography classes and art history classes, but this was in a way my own like self-education thing that I think not a lot of other students were doing as far as I could tell. So anyway, so I go to the library, I go to the TR section or also the art section, which was a different number letters, and then I would just wander through the stacks and pull off books that looked, intriguing to me at all, very, very loosely, no research in advance, anything like that. It was just a shelf wandering, pulling off from the stacks, and I would get a pile of maybe like 10 or 15 books or something like that, and then I'd go sit at a chair. They had these sort of weird chairs there that you could sort of really get into, lounge into, and have, I just have my stack of books, and I would just flip through the books, and um, and at the end, if there was a book that was particularly intriguing to me, then I would check it out, take it home, and it would sort of go into a deeper rotation or something where I would also spend time in my apartment looking at the book, while eating a meal or before I went to bed or whatever. And some of those books were ones that I immediately liked, had a really strong fondness for it. That was also where I first encountered Portraits and Dreams, the book by Wendy Ewald, which was one of those where I was just like, oh, this is amazing. I really love this, and shared it with friends and, looked at it over and over again. The Pond was really different. The reason that I took it with me back home, checked it out, was because I couldn't figure it out. It was really like confounding to me and kind of irritating.
Yes.
So, I would look at the photographs and I'd be like, hold it, these aren't what I'm being told are beautiful photographs or anything like that in my photo classes and things like that. These are like actually kind of, in some cases, they're just sort of like bleak, or like here's an example. I just randomly opened it. There's like a little plant there in the middle, and that's about it. And I was like, "Oh, what is good about these photographs? Why did somebody?" Here's another one that's just like a little trail. There's sort of like subjects in a way, but they're very pedestrian, not dramatic, and sometimes almost like redundant too. Like here's the next shot is another trail, but this one has some boards covering up the wet spot or whatever. And so I was like, "Oh, what is going on here? Why did this book? Why was it considered important enough to make the book?" Here's another one that I think this is one of the ones that would be really confounding to me. It's just like as if you just plop down on the grass and whatever you happen to see there, some little sticks, like that's what you decided to take a photo of. And it in some ways it was countering also some of the things that I'd learned about photography, like with Cartier-Bresson's idea of the decisive moment. These like didn't seem to have any decisiveness to them at all. Like you could find similar stuff at any moment, and in this case, return the next day and the same sticks would probably still be sitting there, and it wouldn't have really changed much at all. There was nothing all that crucial about it. And so this idea that photography was sort of about like and with people like Robert Frank too, this sort of like wandering around and then seeing that moment in which the person does this and that and looks a certain way, or combinations of people come together and form a sort of, looks like a dance, but it's in society, it's just like random. None of that stuff seemed to apply to this at all. And so I was like, what is going on here with this? Here's one where it's just, again, just similar kind of basic landscape, but there's a little fence of like some wire up, and it's like, but okay, so I'd look at them, I'd go through it over and over again, and be sort of confounded. And then I remember this moment, which seems a little bit, I don't know, silly or something, but there was this moment where suddenly I felt like I got it. I guess kind of an epiphany moment, which back then I think I was probably having kind of a lot of epiphanies. So it wasn't that crazy. You know, I was probably whatever, like 19 or something like that, and a lot of new information was coming at me, and I was really trying to be open and trying to understand what was interesting about whatever I was encountering, contemporary
Yeah.
art, contemporary literature, music, film, all of these things I was encountering and kind of shifting from what I had known before and been taught were almost like the standards of those things. And I realized, well, one, as this kind of epiphany happened, where I felt like I could suddenly appreciate the photographs in this book. Um, it was kind of similar to for me, like I started watching really long foreign films also in the library. They had this really good film collection. It was all on like VHS or even like those discs, like huge silver discs, and you just put it in there. And you had to wear these really painful headphones that were like metal. So it was kind of an endurance thing to watch. And then the film would be like 5 hours long, some Polish film or something like that. And I started really getting into that. And I had friends that would do it too. It's fun. We would sort of meet up in there and be like, look around. Everyone's wearing these painful things. Like, this is a good one. You should devote a day to it. Um, and and also like listening to music, different kinds of music. And I started running across this idea of this. I think I first heard it in music, like this idea of like challenging music or difficult music. And I started seeing this as like difficult photography. And on the one hand, that seems sort of annoying or pretentious or something like that. On the other hand, when you start to get into that stuff and you feel it in relationship, like the difference between that and say pop music, which can be great also, but um, it's like that's easy, and then there's this other stuff that's hard, and you're not always in the mood for hard, or difficult, but sometimes you are, and it just has a very different quality for me, and can do this funny thing for me, which is, I think it puts me into a different brain state. It cut the like the process of trying to um, understand or appreciate these difficult things, difficult photographs or difficult music or difficult film or whatever, can sort of put me into this brain uh, mode that's a little bit like meditation or something. That's the only thing I can think of that's kind of similar for me. And
Wow.
yeah, and I go into this like, it's like when people talk about like being in the zone when they're making art or something like that. It's kind of like that, but I'm not making anything. I'm just like processing something. I'm trying to be a very engaged audience to
Yeah.
something, or reader, viewer, listener, whatever it happens to be. So anyway, so that it felt like the Gossage book, this book was kind of that had this breakthrough for me, where I could, once you start to experience it, you can more easily tap into it and apply it to other things. I guess that was sort of how I was experiencing it. And so so once I had like adjusted my the way I was seeing things and the way I was appreciating things, valuing things, I could then apply it to just life in general. And so I started seeing like my own life, my own walk to school, or my
Right.
drive someplace, and I didn't need to necessarily go to Yosemite to see something beautiful. I could just like walk down an alleyway and see it. I realized the feeling was pretty similar. It was more like an internal perspective than it was the external whatever it was, and that in a way, by kind of like lowering my like tolerance or something. Like by not needing things to look spectacular, but also I think, and this is something Laura and I were talking about yesterday. We were looking at a Winogrand book, which I love Winogrand's work too. But there's a lot of times like little zingers, funny things that are going on in the photographs, and they're easier to sort of see and appreciate. And those things are great. But if you always need that, then you're always like your tolerance level keeps like going up. You need more like of those kinds of things, something extreme, really weird, really never seen before, really funny, whatever. And so I liked the idea that I was instead trying to push my tolerance in the other direction, like creating like a heightened sensitivity at like lower levels that I wouldn't need the extremes. I could see it in the really low level stuff. And so I feel like the pond was very instrumental for me in getting my mind into that, and then for me to then apply that to eventually my own work, taking photographs, making projects, writing things, whatever it happened to be. And some of that was a realization that I was interested in like the everyday, the things that were very available to me that I could walk out my door and encounter were more interesting to me than the idea that I needed to travel someplace to encounter what was going to,
Right.
would be interesting enough to make work about or something like that.
Right. Are you thinking about, how often are you thinking about the pond in your current life?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I was talking to a couple people yesterday about a photography project, and it came up. So, and it just does come up for me quite a bit. Um, yeah, I mean, there's periods where it maybe sort of drifts off for a while or something, but it is a touchstone book and set of photographs and approach for me that for me personally, and I know for many other people, but for me personally, is highly significant. And it could, unless it does feel a little bit like one of these things, like you'll run across other people and you could say like, about like John Gossage's The Pond, and if they're like, oh yeah, like then you realize like, oh okay, we both have like figured this thing out and are able to appreciate it, and so we have this common knowledge, common language that can be communicated. This gets into that like high context communication thing, that when you run across someone and you realize you both have the pond in common, then suddenly it's like, okay, we can talk about all kinds of things in relationship to this that are like on a similar level, and it will be understood using the pond as sort of the basis for that or something like that.
But you wouldn't, I mean, I think some people would reference William Eggleston in that same way. And maybe is Eggleston on that continuum of the very available?
No, I mean a lot of Eggleston's work is super difficult also. Yeah, I mean some of it isn't, some of it is more available, easily available, and a lot of it's not. So like the Democratic Forest or whatever, like
Right, yeah.
tons of stuff where you're just like, what the heck? And the book itself is not. This is one of the things I guess about this, and maybe it makes it a little less difficult, is that because it's such. I mean, again, it has to do with taste, but and probably initially my reaction was like, what? This is like really ugly looking colors and stuff. But now I think of it as very beautiful and just so intentional. It's like really intentional. I think in the case of Eggleston's books, I don't get the sense that he was in charge of their design
Mm.
in the same way that Gossage
Oh,
was. My sense is, and from the little bit I've read or heard or whatever, Gossage is very intense about how the books are made, the layout, the design, these other, like by including that page I showed where he had crossed out all of this stuff like that. I don't get the sense that Eggleston was doing things like that. He was just taking zillions of photos and and kind of letting other people sort them out to some degree, especially when it came to books.
sure. Okay.
Yeah, but definitely lots of difficult. images in there, and a similar thing. And I do recall looking at some Eggleston's books um, too, and feeling like, okay, I need to figure this out. It's giving me a challenge, but for me, it was a challenge that my brain liked. Like my
Mm.
brain was engaged by that challenge, which is weird. It's just like the challenge is just like, can you look at this visual thing and find some significance in it, find value in it, a kind of beauty, even if it's not classic beauty. And it's not something that it's not a challenge the way that like a crossword puzzle is a challenge where at the end you're like, okay, I completed it, done. I'll do the next one tomorrow. It's a much more amorphous thing that's going on, and it's not ever fully complete. It's just sort of like moving around in that realm, which for me is more satisfying than doing a crossword puzzle can be fun, but this is like kind of it. It's it is like I was saying, like meditation. My experiences with meditation or something. It's something where you feel like you're experiencing your brain in a new way, and being able to explore things, think about things from a completely different perspective and a different bodily feeling. Everything's changed as a result of it. And so when I'm exploring difficult photographs or art projects or concepts, writing, all films, music, whatever, that will activate the brain maybe in a way that kind of like it's a different thing than meditation, but in the same sort of category. Puts me into a different mindset. I know there's like whatever different waves or something. Feels like some kind of different wave is occurring in my brain, and then it's just like it's a kind that I like. My brain likes it. The way that
Wait, that
maybe
may
the way that maybe other people like heroin or something like that.
oh, interesting contrast there. But that makes me think about what oh thinking fast and slow.
Mm-hmm.
The brain. What's he call it? Like brain one and brain two, or like
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
brain is the wrong word, but system one likes the zinger. System
Right.
two is perplexed, and it takes system two longer. So you're saying, if we were thinking about it in those terms, a book like The Pond is a system two, harder to figure out, but gives a different line of pleasure almost, or yeah,
Right.
beauty.
Definitely. It's in this thinking slow, and it's it's understood that these are kind of constructs to think about it through. They're not actually there's not two systems in your brain, but um, that in that way. Um, but yes, I think that's the idea there. It's
I
a
think one thing that really surprised me is this was only Gossage's second book, and really it was his first like commercial book. And it wasn't a catalog for an exhibit, which makes me a question for you is, could you have had this epiphany in an exhibit space of this work? Did it matter that it was in a book?
I think it did. It's possible it could have happened in an exhibition situation. I've always preferred to look at photographs, this kind of photograph, small ones, as opposed to big like Cindy Sherman's or something, or Jeff Wall. I've preferred to look at them in books and not walking in a gallery. So yeah, so I think that it being in the book was important. I just realized my phone's about to die. Sorry. It's, it's rare that I forget to plug my phone, but I did last night, and so this was a bad timing. I forgot I needed to do that.
I almost reminded you. I was like, of course, I don't need to remind someone to plug their phone in. Oh no, you disappeared. Oh wait,
I'm
now
back.
you're
I'm
back.
back.
Yeah, yeah. Did you want to
Yeah.
say anything else about book versus exhibit in terms of The Pond?
What happens if I flip my phone? Okay. Well, am I upside down?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it doesn't matter, but the cord's in the way now for it to sit. Oh God. Okay, I'll just hold it. Sorry, what was the question?
Do you want to say anything else about exhibit versus book in terms of the pond?
Well, just that I think that, and this is well known. Lots of people have this opinion that photographs work really well in books because you can sequence them and make sure that people are sort of, I mean, not for sure, a reader could flip through them backwards or randomly or something like that, but you get to at least sort of assert what you want as the sequence. You can do it in a gallery too, but it's even less likely that people are going to feel like they do that. I have a set of 5 photographs up in a show right now, and they're intended to go from left to right, and I noticed that people just don't do that at all. They'll just approach it the other direction. And so it's harder to control in a gallery situation than in a book. But also, I think the thing about the book is that it's like it includes all of these other things, like I was saying, like the design of the cover, the essay. It's like a little self-contained world of information that the artist is sort of trying to convey when it's a book of this nature. And so I think for me it was probably necessary. Plus, like I said, I encountered it not there was no place I would have encountered an exhibition of John Gossage's work in Arcata at that time, but I could encounter it as a multiple in book form in the library. And then I could take it with me from the library to my own apartment and bring it with me to a friend's house or out to wherever I wanted to. And so you're having experiences with it that are on your own terms, and they're very intimate. You're holding the book, you're turning the pages, all of those kinds of things, which are different than when you're standing looking at framed photographs on the wall that you're not supposed to touch and you can't take with you in any way. So I think a book is ideal for various things, but especially for a sequence of photographs that are intended to go together.
Do you feel that way about artist books in general? Like you've expressed that looking at something like The Pond, which is challenging at first and maybe at second glance, but I find for myself looking at artist books, they're so ambiguous I can't get into them and often will just shove them aside. Does your understanding of how this body of work functions make it so you can access other artists' books in the same way?
Not necessarily. I mean, it does, because I mean, in this, I mean, some, like I said, some things, like by feeling like I worked my way through understanding this book, I could then apply it to other things, but only things that had some similarities going on with them. So just like because it's an artist book doesn't make it that the content is going to be variable and the way that it's made. And I've actually, I don't know, I think I have a slight aversion to artist books, actually, based on ones that I've seen. I don't really I love the book form that has been figured out already, where you just have a cover and flip through the pages. It's like a really ideal form to me. And since a lot of times what's happening in artist books is that they're trying to sort of subvert that form, and it seems to be more about that than it is about using the form to then convey content, that I kind of resist them, because I'm like, I actually really like books. I don't need it to be deconstructed and made into something else. It's interesting, but it's not really interesting to me in relationship to books. They're like a different thing, and they're a little bit, they can be a little bit frustrating to me, almost in a way, like, I don't know, this popped in my head. I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but kind of like when people make ceramic things that look like teapots, but they're not functional as teapots. Like, I actually like teapots, and I like them when they function, and I can use them for tea, and I can value it aesthetically. But when they make a non-functional teapot, I'm not as interested in it for some reason. I wouldn't mind it if it was just a sculpture, and I wouldn't mind it if it was a functional teapot. But non-functional teapots for some reason are frustrating to me. And for some reason, artist books, not always, but some of them, some percentage that I've encountered, feel kind of like that to me. Like they've subverted the book to the degree where it doesn't function as a book anymore. And I actually like books. So
Yeah.
they slightly irritate me in that way.
Phew, I love hearing that. That's great. Well, I want to talk about the role that making books plays in your practice. Do you want to, what comes up if I say, talk about books and publishing in your socially engaged practice or non-socially engaged practice? Up to you.
Sure. Yeah, so I, as I described, I started by going and looking at all of these books and really liking them, as an undergraduate at the Humboldt State Library. And then I realized, oh, I could just make a book. And so I started making books around that time initially. And part of why I really liked them actually was because I had limited access to doing exhibitions. Like I did whatever exhibitions I could do as a student using the student resources of, the gallery or something that was there. But I had more ideas than I had opportunities to do exhibitions. And I wanted to have a form in which I could put them together and other people could experience them. And so I just started making one of a kind. These would probably fall under artist books, but I was really trying to not subvert the book. I was trying to make them as book-like as possible, but just with limited resources. So mostly I was just using typing paper, staples to bind, and then putting photographs, taping them on to the page, typing or writing, and sort of trying as much as I could to sort of just simulate a real book. But they were one of a kind and they were very scrappy. But once I had put it together, I could give it to somebody, a teacher or a friend to look at. And it was, instead of like handing them a stack of photographs or something that wasn't sequenced necessarily, even if it was sequenced, they might not realize that and not look at it in that way. And so it formalized it, solidified it, allowed me to make a kind of complete thought through the making of these books. So initially I just made lots of these one-of-a-kind ones, and they became more and more elaborate, but not in a book arts kind of way. They became like thicker. Like I ended up making one that was over 100 pages, and they just got more intense in that way, I guess. Probably 20 books like that. And then I wanted to be able to, I did this funny thing where I would make a book for someone and give it to them, but then I would want it back because it was only a one of a kind one, and I would feel I just would want it back. And so I would sometimes be like, well, I made this book for you, Alicia McCarthy or whatever, but I'm gonna just you can look at it and then I'm gonna take it back again or something like that. So anyway, I realized like that's probably not so great. So I need to make them in some way where there's multiples. And so the easiest way to do that at that point was just through Xerox machines, which were becoming more and more available, but weren't really even that common in the early days of this. And so the quality went way down because they were no longer, photos that I had printed. They were reproductions, Xerox reproductions of photos I had printed. But the thing that went up was that I could make 100 copies of them and give them to people for free, and then they would have them. And so that was really important to me. And I didn't sell them; I just gave them away. And so then there was a whole series of those kinds of books, probably 10 or so books like that, and then also starting to work with like this Art Center Creativity Explorer in San Francisco that I worked at and collaborated with Elizabeth Meyer, and we started a magazine, sort of like a Xerox magazine of the artists' work from that place. Each one was one artist. Each issue was just focused on one artist. So doing things like that, and then eventually starting to work in this collaboration with John Rubin that I did in graduate school, and we would sometimes make little publications to go along with projects that we did. That was happening, and then eventually I started later getting actually to work with publishers and make make books of various kinds, sometimes with a lot of control, sometimes with very little control, which is part of what happens when it starts to enter that realm. Yeah, and I worked a lot with a couple of different designers too, and so it sort of shifted from this thing that I was just doing in my bedroom and with staples and tape to working with regular publishing places and publishing things that could be mass produced. And then as that sort of tapered off, the one of the new technologies that appeared was just doing on-demand publications. And by then I was doing work here in town with Lisa Jarrett and others at Chaos Mocha. And a big part of what we wound up doing was making these catalogs to go along with exhibitions and things like that, using the on-demand approach and working with these amazing designers like Molly Sherman and Kimberly Sutherland and all that. So anyway, so there's been an
Yeah.
evolution, but books have definitely been a big part of my practice always, and just partly because I have an affinity for them, and partly because they do have this ability to extend the work out of standard um, art spaces so that they can be available to people in other locations, the way that I described my own experience with library books.
Right, right. When you're taking pictures in your daily life, are you thinking of how they might fit into a book?
Just recently I have been. I hadn't really so much in general, but lately I've been thinking more and more about that. Yeah. And so, yeah.
And when you do the more socially engaged projects, are you also having a book in the back of your mind when you're doing that kind of work?
Well, another sort of variation that I drifted into for a while was not books exactly, but like newspaper style publications,
Oh, right,
and
right.
those would oftentimes accompany socially engaged projects that I was doing, or even be the form that it took. And the reason for that was because it was it was a way of extending what I was talking about that I first sort of encountered with just doing Xerox. You could you could make 1,000 copies, literally 1,000 copies for a few $100s or something like that, and be able to distribute it for free to a really wide number of people. So I made lots and lots of newspaper projects that oftentimes accompanied socially engaged projects, and one of them took was an aspect of it was sort of the formalization of a project that I did that involved lots and lots of people in New York City that was done for the 2004 Whitney Biennial. But the thing that people encountered in the museum was just stacks of these newspapers and that they could take with them. And so over time, because that's where people were getting them from, we made, I can't remember how many, like 6,000 copies or something like that, which was still, and I would go to the place where it was being printed in Queens and oversee the printing of it and see how it was done, which is just like the way that all newspapers are done. They call it web press. It doesn't have anything to do with the internet. And it's just these big, vast, like webs of the printing process as it's sort of shooting through all of this stuff. Anyway, so it was just another way of being able to formalize something, but also make it easily available to people and for free. The web itself, the internet web, is another version of that. And so in some ways, I think of some projects that have taken the form of internet things like Learning to Love You More or something like that, kind of thinking of it as like a book that could be added to. Um, and so that was kind of what Miranda and I were thinking early on. We were both fans of books, and we're like, oh, here's this web thing. We're not interested in technology at all, but it does give us this ability to make this sort of ever expanding book in a way. And so that I think that was sort of more how we were approaching it. And eventually we made a book, but
Right.
that one had the limitations of a normal book in that it couldn't be updated. And so that's the nice thing about a web-based project is you can keep adding to it.
Yeah. Well, our hour is almost up. What else do you have on your mind in regards to the pond that we should finish up with?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would just say, and again, this is just sort of based on my own experience and fondness, but I encourage people to go to libraries and spend time just aimlessly wandering around in those situations, because there's just so much there, and it is a very different experience. Even though I see lots of benefits to being able to use the internet to do research or to learn about artists or all of these things, I think it's a very different experience to both wander the stacks of a library and sort of discover things that you're not expecting in that way, and then to have the physical experience of holding, touching the book and flipping through it at a certain speed. And I mean, I like books too. I mean, I was talking before about that an artist gets to sort of control the sequence, and obviously it's intended to go in this particular order. But I'm also a big fan of this broader way of thinking about reading, or a way of thinking about interacting with a book, which, and I think this was a lot of what I was doing in those early days when I was talking about like taking 10 or 15 books off a stack. I didn't read each one of them, and I didn't necessarily look at every page on them. So I think one way that we could think of reading a book is like holding it. That's like looking at just the cover, the back cover. That's an aspect to a reader or audience person's relationship to the book. And like deciding to open the very back and just like read the back first, that could be,
Yeah.
and maybe that's it. Maybe that's your only experience with the book, like, and that could be a powerful experience. Maybe there's something there. I oftentimes do flip through books backwards. And so I'll just flip through kind of, looking at it like that. And that's an experience that's also, it's available to you with a book in a certain way. And it's not like I said, it's not necessarily how the artist intended it, but because it's available to the book, it's part of the reader's sort of like prerogative to be able to interact with the book in all of these different ways. And so another way would be to just like randomly open to a page and then spend some time like looking at that page that you randomly sort of looked wound up with. And I think all of these kinds of things, all of these different ways of interacting with the book and interacting with the stacks in the library,
Yes.
another place where you can do a lot of this kind of meander, chance encounter, different kinds of physical relationships to the books as objects. I think all of those are potentially very significant experiences to have. And for me, I guess as an artist, as a photographer, as a writer, as a bookmaker, kind of person or whatever, and a library maker, I've made libraries also. All of those things were very significant, fundamental for me in conceiving of the work that I wanted to do, was having these relationships and these experiences with the books and with the libraries and the stacks and all of that. So I just encourage people to do that, because we're lucky enough to have libraries, which really, I mean, what a weird concept in a capitalist society that we would have these places to go into for free. You can borrow things for free. They help you in all of these different ways. They make things available to you in all these different ways. And I think that maybe it's not just that we don't take advantage of that as much now. Like I said, even back when I was doing this as an undergrad student, none of my fellow students were doing that. I didn't bump into them in the library in the TR section or anything like that. So I know that this is something that has just been significant and important to me, but I would just encourage people to do it. And I think there is this. I think part of what I was saying before, that it was like a respite for me. Like if school was being sort of, I was having anxiety about stuff, walking into that library, having this relationship where I knew nobody was going to bother me. No, there was no pressure. Nobody was trying to sell me anything, nothing like that. I just had this ability to go and drift and, be in this other mind body space is just something that from my experience and perspective is really significant, and that we just don't do enough, in the same sort of way as we don't go enough on enough walks, or we don't spend enough in nature. We don't, things like that. I just think that the library is one of those things that from my perspective, and I would encourage people to spend more time doing that.
Well, it goes back to the beginning of our conversation about the epiphany you had about the pond and being in a different mind space. And the library is just like Gossage's pond. It's a place you can go pick out what to take a photo of, even if it's not classic beauty Ansel Adams style. You still get to search, keep,
right,
revisit,
mm-hmm.
rest.
Right.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
The Pond has always been a really hard book for me to look at, and now it's much less hard to look at. So thank you for sharing your story and looking at the book with me.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, John Gossage.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, go John. All right. Well, talk to you
all right
sometime soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.